Yes, of course. So, good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of the FSHD Society, we welcome you to this month's FSHD University. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping reminders. Please make sure that you use the Q&A section of the webinar so that we can ask your questions during our Q&A time. While we do encourage you to use the chat, we do want to let you know that we don't monitor it for questions. We do go through that Q&A portion, so please make sure that you use that. This session will also be recorded and available on our YouTube channel. So we encourage you to feel free to look back on it if you have any, if you want to hear anything again. And with that, we'd like to kind of introduce today's topic. So we're really excited to welcome our very own Anna Gilmore, Senior Director of Advocacy and Education, and Kevin Brennan from Bluebird Strategies to discuss an exciting new opportunity for you to get involved in advocacy and help diversify funding for the much needed research in FSHD that we need. So many of you know Anna Gilmore. She's absolutely amazing, and she's been with the Society now for 7 years and has worked closely with our community in a number of capacities, such as launching our FSHD Navigator program, working with our volunteers to activate their local communities in the chapter program, and even leading our first Capitol Hill Day. But in her current role, Anna leads our advocacy initiatives and is extremely excited to present today with Kevin. Kevin Brennan has 3 decades of success leading policy, advocacy, and political initiatives in senior roles in Congress, the biopharma industry, and the patient advocacy field. On Capitol Hill, he has served as Chief of Staff to Representative Rosa DeLauro and Legislative Director to Representative, who's actually now Senator, Sherrod Brown. And Kevin founded Bluebird Strategies in 2019, which is an innovative and effective lobbying, advocacy, and life sciences consulting firm. We're really excited to have both of them. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Anna and Kevin.
Thank you so much. And I just wanted to add a couple of little things. Kevin is our legislative advocacy consultant for this year. We're so pleased to have him. He has a lot of experience and success in other neuromuscular spaces. So we're very pleased to have him on our side here. And, brings a lot of really innovative ideas and ways that we can push the field forward faster.
Thank you very much, Anna. It is an absolute pleasure to be here. I'm going to, I think I can share a screen here so I can pull up my slides. Let's see. All right. Anna, can you see those? Just give me a thumbs up. Okay, good. All right. So let me get started. I'm going to be looking a little bit sort of towards my screen as I'm going back and forth between slides and this. So forgive me for not being fully engaged and making eye contact with everybody here on the webinar. So thank you guys for that kind introduction. It is an absolute honor to be working with Ashley and Anna and the entire FSHD Society team, staff, and volunteers to try to move us forward into the future as we think about continuing to build the base of research that will be necessary to drive us towards treatments and eventually a cure. We are at an incredibly important point, I think, in the history of biomedical research in this country. And so I think it's an incredibly important opportunity for this community to raise our voice collectively. I think that there's been a lack of appreciation perhaps from some folks who are elected officials in Washington and perhaps even at the state level about how important research is. And I think it's a unique opportunity that we'll start to talk a little bit about why that's really important. So with that, let me move into our first slide. Sorry, there we go. So I wanted to just quickly review what we want to learn today, what we want to talk about, we want to get your questions on, is a quick little snapshot of past and present FSHD federal research funding. So you'll have an understanding of kind of the baseline of where we are. A little bit of a background on kind of where things stand with the new administration and the new Congress. There's been a lot of media reports, a lot of heat and light on these things, and want to drill down and explain and put some of these things into context. Really, what does this mean for the work that we're trying to do to increase research funding? And then we want to talk about, as Anna mentioned, the advocacy initiative that we're launching this year. And then finally, explain the important role that you all can play in helping us be successful in increasing the amount of biomedical research funding that's available for FSHD researchers. Sorry, I keep clicking on the wrong button. So what I want to talk to you about, and this is something you'll see at the bottom of this slide, there's a source here. You can go to the NIH website and research this information and look at it. This is one segment of a very large chart that lists out sort of the top areas of research funding by the National Institutes of Health. And so as you look at this, in the blue area up top, you have the first number there is fiscal year 2016. Okay. And then below that, you'll see FSHD and the number 9. And then as you move throughout those fiscal years, 17, 18, 19, 20, you'll see a slight uptick to 11 in 2017, maintain that level, and then it starts to decline again. It pops back to 10 in 2022. But I think that, we'd all agree that this is a flat level of funding. Arguably, when you factor in inflation, which does affect the cost of running a research lab, it affects salaries, it affects the equipment that you need to purchase, all of the things that go into it. I would dare say, and FSHD is not alone. If you look at other, comparable conditions like myotonic dystrophy, this number is kind of in the same flat pattern. It is a challenge. And I think one of the things to understand is it's difficult to influence that number using advocacy. So I think that, it's important to understand that we're looking at what we're going to talk about is another avenue, another way to secure research funding. But arguably the only areas where I've seen significant change in NIH funding has been in Alzheimer's. And that community has been able to make a case to say, given the population, demographic changes and the prevalence of that, the more we learn about it, they've been able to get Congress to push a lot more money into that research area. In general, you find, though, that members of Congress will say, well, I'm not a scientist. I can't dictate how they spend this money. NIH will say, well, we have a peer review process, and that's how these funds get sorted out. Yeah, mostly true. But there is a squeaky wheel component here. And it's just tends to be more difficult for the rare disease community to have a huge impact here. So in light of this flat funding, let me just get to one more slide and then I'll get to the next piece here. So, oh wait, all right, I don't know if I can go back. Anyway, if you click on the fiscal year that you saw on that previous slide, when you get to that source that I had shared with you guys, you can actually pull up and see all the individual research grants that were awarded under a fiscal year. So this is just a snapshot. This is a longer list here, but I didn't want to have 3 slides of just all of this basic same information. I just wanted to give you guys an understanding. So you can see as you move across the blue top line here, funding by IC just means institute or center. So the center here is the National Cancer Institute funded this first project. You move down, there's a project number, a sub-project number, but the project title is the next important thing. So this is funding the studies into the reactivation of an early embryonic program of FSHD and cancer. And then PI just stands for the principal investigator. So that's the researcher who, was successful in putting together the grant application that was reviewed and then awarded funding. So Danielle Ham here. And then the organization name is the Academic Medical Center, usually that's leading this effort where the lab is located. So the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center in the state of Washington, and then you can see the amount. So this funding was for $71,792. So all along here, you'll see all of that information listed. If you want to go to the site and sort of have a better understanding of that, that's important. One area to think about, and when we get into our point of getting you all, up to speed on the grassroots advocacy, if you live in one of these states, so if you're in Washington or New York or Nevada or Michigan or Connecticut, it might be important for you to include that information in your appeal to Congress, because they're going to care about the fact that there are people with FSHD that live in their state or congressional district, but there's also a case to be made of, hey, we're funding, jobs and research in this state that is actively, engaged. So members of Congress like to know that there's a connection to employment and innovation happening in their state. So feel free to go through that and see if any of these research centers are in your home state so that you can highlight that. Oh, and the last thing here too, you'll notice this is fiscal year 2023. So while the funding gets released each fiscal, or the funding gets appropriated each fiscal year, there's always a lag because it takes time for the researchers to put together their grant applications. They have to go through multiple reviews, and then it just takes a while. So usually the funding is announced, usually a year or two after the fiscal year. So we still have got 2024 to get released at some point, probably sometime this year, and that will be updated on the site. So that's why this is the most recent information that's available through NIH. So based on the fact that NIH has been flat funded, we are looking at, are there other pots of money that we can help, encourage researchers to apply for that will allow us to increase that number, since the NIH part has been a challenge. So in 1992, Congress established what's called the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. And the National Breast Cancer Coalition was a group that helped pioneer this. They were similarly frustrated at the time that NIH was not being responsive to their advocacy around breast cancer research. They felt that women's health was not being a priority at the agency, and they weren't funding important research. They're disinterested in certain questions around breast cancer that only science could answer. And so they went to a couple of members of the Senate and said, hey, can we create another program? And they did it within the Department of Defense. And so it's a bit unusual. It's a program that has funded about $16 billion in research, since its inception. It is unique in that it is never part of the president's budget request that gets submitted. So it's probably the only program where each year Congress has to step up and create the program and fund it. So, and it's bipartisan. President Obama, President Clinton, President Trump, no one's ever included it in their budget, and hence the term congressionally directed. So if Congress didn't act, and there's no reference to this in the budget, so our advocacy and congressional support is important. Within the CDMRP program, there's something called the peer-reviewed medical research program, and CDMRP and then PRMRP tend to be a tongue twister, I acknowledge. So don't feel like you there won't be any homework after this as to defining each of these. But just know that PRMRP is our target for our advocacy work. And that is usually funded at about $380 million. And then what Congress does is they list a bunch of different diseases or conditions that are then eligible to apply for funding for research support. So there'll be a whole opportunity after, we are successful in this effort to work with them to help educate our researchers as to what the world looks like, because applying for an NIH grant is different than applying for a PRMRP grant. And so we'll be working with folks to advance that.
And I would just add too that the reason we're going after this is not to make things more complicated and more difficult for our researchers to find money. It's to diversify the sources from which research funding can come.
Yeah, this presents an entire new opportunity for folks to apply. And so if you're not listed in the report that I'm going to share with you, then the researcher cannot apply or be awarded money, no matter how meritorious their grant application is. So as I said, this past year, last summer, when the Senate passed their version of the Defense Appropriations Bill, they included $370 million for PRMRP, and they made 48 diseases and conditions eligible for funding. One thing that the Senate does as they look at this is as folks do their work, they might get comments from some of the Senate office saying, well, this has to be tied to the warfighter. It's not written in any law or any guidance as to how this process works. It's a way of trying to prioritize certain funding within the program. And I think what's important to know is that, Duchenne muscular dystrophy has been eligible for the program for the past couple of years. And there's a number of conditions in here where you'd say, well, I don't understand exactly how this is tied to the warfighter. This is tied to our, capabilities there, other than you might have a soldier or an airman or a Marine who has a dependent who has Duchenne muscular dystrophy. And you could argue, okay, well, then that has some impact on their readiness or those sorts of things. But I only say that just because some folks might get notes back from, their inquiries to the Senate about our request, and they'll say, well, it has to be tied to the warfighter. It's true that it is in the Department of Defense, but it's a way to try to, in some ways, put advocates off. And just know that, they're not, the Senate isn't always consistent in how they apply these things. So we have every right and should be pushing for inclusion for the reasons we'll talk about that we know exist as to, the need for more research funding, the urgency that's involved, and the fact that we have no FDA, approved treatments. So I think all of those are in our favor that we'll talk about. But just, in case you hear that, just be aware and don't let it throw you. So eligibility isn't a guarantee of research funding. The grant, proposals have to be quality. But again, I think this is where the follow-up is important that we will do once we're eligible, where we'll make sure that our researchers are aware of this opportunity, so they're seeking it out. And then they're connected with the folks who run the program so they understand how to prepare, an application that has a higher chance of being successful. I think that's really key. So then just a couple examples of things that were included in this year's bill. So cardiac health, Fragile X, ataxias, multiple sclerosis, myotonic dystrophy, and Angelman syndrome are all in there. Myotonic dystrophy has been in there, and I work with the Myotonic Dystrophy Foundation on this effort. Their researchers have successfully been awarded about $24 million in grant funding since they were an eligible condition. So, it's a significant opportunity that we hope to also take advantage of. And then, as I mentioned, there are more advanced funding streams within the CDMRP program that have just specific line items that are walled off and only dedicated for that particular identified condition. So breast cancer is one, Alzheimer's is one, arthritis has one, and as I mentioned, Duchenne muscular dystrophy for a number of years has had a CDMRP, line item. So they're not in that larger pool of PRMRP funding. They just have one that is restricted just for them. It takes a long time to build up the kind of political support that you can do that. It's something down the road for folks to consider, but I think the first step in this process is always to seek out eligibility within the PRMRP program. And just to the right, that's just a copy of what the Defense Appropriations Bill, the title page, looks like. So folks kind of know, what that looks like. So what is our objective this year? Okay, pretty simple. Our objective is to secure United States Senate support for FSHD eligibility for research funding as part of the peer-reviewed medical research program as part of the fiscal year 2026 Defense Appropriations Report. So that is our goal. And if we are successful, that will put us in a position for our researchers to apply and successfully be awarded this funding. So let's talk a little bit about what's happening right now in Washington. And many of you may be reading reports in the paper about things. If you've seen a lot of different things about Elon Musk and different, federal government employee terminations, and you may be hearing about, how this is impacting the National Institutes of Health. Right now, they're not able to release grants. So let me just kind of talk a little bit about sort of what's happening. So on Friday, the Senate passed what's called a continuing resolution. And not to get too into the arcane weeds of the congressional budget process, but the federal fiscal year runs from October 1 to September 30th. And, if you kind of go back to your high school civics classes, Congress has the power of the purse. The president sends them a budget recommendation. They then take that and, they might support aspects of the president's budget. They may not support other aspects. They're supposed to pass the House and Senate their own different appropriations bills. What we're interested in here is the Department of Defense bill. We also care about one that funds the NIH. There are two different bills that come out. The Senate will have a different bill. The House will have a different bill at some point in the summer. They meet, they talk about how to align around one final bill that's supposed to be passed by, September 30th, and then the government hums along in its next fiscal year. That process has broken down over the last couple of years, and Congress has been forced to pass what they call continuing resolutions. Usually, they're kind of short-term funding patches. And all they do by saying continuing, it just means you take the funding levels from the previous fiscal year and you continue them for a month or 3 months or weeks, but you're trying to congressionally buy yourself some time until you can get your final budget that may have, different priorities set for the new fiscal year. What they did this time around was they had set a March deadline of the 14th to pass this bill. And they called this a continuing resolution, but it's not, and it hasn't really been a true continuing resolution in that it cut $13 billion from what's called non-defense discretionary funding. And again, just to explain what that means, you have entitlement program funding, which is automatic. So Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. So if you meet the eligibility requirements to qualify for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, that funding automatically goes to you as a beneficiary. But if you're funding the Department of Education or your Department of Labor, that's funding that Congress can decide on a discretionary basis. Do I want to provide $10 million for this, $0, $100 million? Do I want to keep that program? Do I want to get rid of it? All of those things are up to Congress's discretion, right? There are not automatic payments that go out largely for those agencies. So anything that is non-defense is not part of the Pentagon budget. It is not an entitlement. It's everything else that runs the various departments in the government. And so that took a $13 billion cut. So some folks have argued from the Democratic perspective that it's not really a continuing resolution if you're going to take deep cuts like that in those programs, because you're really having a more material impact on the budget than that. So one of the areas that was cut within the Department of Defense, and there weren't a lot of cuts in the Department of Defense, was the CDMRP program. And so this is really significant. So I go back to kind of my opening comments about how important the FSHD Society's involvement is right now. We as an organization spoke out against those cuts in letters to Congress, and lots of our, partnering sister, organizations did the same. So folks in the rare disease community, folks in the chronic, disease community, it was a very broad communication. The challenge was we didn't have a lot of time to mobilize. The text of this continuing resolution only became public a few days before the House voted and then the Senate voted. So while this was a very unfortunate cut, and it doesn't have any direct impact on our advocacy right now, I think we're hopefully going to see a lot of organizations that are aligned with us starting to speak out very forcefully about how this cut needs to be reversed going into 2026 budget. And so I think, as I said, a great opportunity for us to educate members of Congress about our disease, why we are deserving of funding, and how the science is so vitally important. Okay. So our ability to share our stories about how FSHD affects us and our family members, is so important to share that story, I think, is what gives me hope that we can fix this and restore the funding to this program and make sure that we are eligible for funding as a part of it. But it's, I think, an important point to emphasize. There's lots of discussion now, too, about Elon Musk and the work that he's doing as part of the Department of Government Efficiency. Just a couple of factual points to point out. This is called a department. It is not a congressionally authorized by law new department like you'd have the Department of Interior, the Department of Defense. These are all things that were created by Congress. They're in statute. They exist. This was created through an executive order of the president, which the president has the authority to do. But the name I always find is a little bit not exactly in matching with what you'd expect of a fully federal department. So, what they have been doing is have been going into these agencies and usually going after staff that are called probationary. And all that really means is they're new staff. but they're not necessarily 22-year-old new. I'll give you an example. One of my neighbors spent 2.5 decades as a national security archivist at the National Archives. And about a year ago, he decided to accept a job at the State Department doing a lot of the same things he's doing now. So he is a probationary employee at the Department of State, but he's not new. And so it just means that for these folks, there are fewer civil service protections. And I think the thinking is it's easier to take some of those folks and move them out of these agencies if you're trying to make cuts. The challenge is that by going after probationary employees, it's not necessarily a strategic way of making cuts. You're just sort of Swiss cheesing, sort of pulling certain people out. And so I don't think we've quite sort of fully seen and understood how this is going to affect some of the agencies that we care about. One of the things that there's a concern about, and I forgot to add NIH here, and I apologize, is that NIH currently has about 21,100 staff members. This week, there is likely to be anywhere from 3,000 to 5,000 terminations of scientists and intramural researchers and folks leading clinical trials and administrative support staff. And so we're keeping an eye on that. And lots of other agencies like FDA, CDC, others that are important because the research is great. But then if the drug developers are working on their, new therapies, they have to submit those to FDA, and there have to be specialized staff and scientists in place to determine, if those clinical trial data, net out to be a safe and effective product. So some of the FDA staff are paid by user fees, but there's still a significant federal funding component to that. And so, again, I think another area that we're going to be actively monitoring and commenting on to make sure that we are protecting the interests of individuals with FSHD so that, we're not just focused on the research part, we're looking at the full continuum that's so important to everyone. Lastly, some of these rulings, there's been 2 judicial rulings to date that have ruled that these terminations are illegal, that they were not following the civil service law, they were not involving Congress. So right now, I think some of these folks have been quote unquote brought back, but they've been put on paid leave. So again, we'll continue to see this. So I share these things just to understand the sort of the situation in Washington. Anna, let me pitch it to you.
Yeah, I guess I just want to bring in some comments in discussions that we had at the MDA conference this past week. First of all, this CDMRP cut of 57% applies to fiscal year 25, and what we're talking about advocating for applies to fiscal year 26. And so some of the conversations that I was having with, with MDA and other patient advocacy organizations in our broader space is that, we were worried at first about how this would filter down and impact it. And, should we redirect our energies or should we change strategy? But generally the consensus has been, no, we should actually push this forward even harder, because if we are doing this advocacy, we are demonstrating to our elected officials how important this pool of funding is. And so we are pressing forward with our plans as designed, and other organizations are doing the same. And I think that will be important.
Thanks, Anna. That's absolutely right. All right, so let me move into the next slide here. Okay, so what are our next steps? Where are we headed, right? We're still waiting for the president to submit his budget. And this is usually kind of normal. A new administration, it takes a little bit longer. The budget submission usually in your second, third, and fourth year in office usually happens, say, maybe in the mid-February range. And that kicks off the congressional appropriations process. They start hearings, they bring in witnesses. The head of NIH testifies, the head of CDC testifies. So all of these different agency and department heads come before Congress to explain and even in some cases defend the president's budget recommendations. And then that process kind of winds down in the May timeframe, and then they start to put together these actual budgets. So they kind of go behind closed doors and start to draft the language that's going to go into those bills. So this year, we haven't seen the president's budget for fiscal year 2026 yet. We anticipate it could come end of March, beginning of April. Congress, because they don't have, sort of a shrunken timeline, is going to start the process now that they've finally closed the books on fiscal year 2025 last Friday. So they're going to be doing a little bit of kind of, building the airplane as you fly it, as they say. So they're going to probably start the public hearing process sooner, even before they have a presidential budget in place. So we're heading into a period of time now where we want to get activated. We want to start, communicating to Congress and educating them about FSHD and sharing with them kind of our urgency as to, why we feel that we deserve to be included in this, and asking our senators to support our request. Okay. And I should just make this point because this is, again, I talked about how CDMRP is a strange creature, so to speak, and that it's not in the president's budget and it's purely a congressional created thing. It gets a little stranger too, because some of you may ask, well, wait a minute, Kevin, you're talking about the Senate. Why aren't you talking about the other side of the Capitol and the House of Representatives? Whereas the CDMRP funding that I talked about is driven by both the House and the Senate, PRMRP is only a Senate program. So we're only going to be asking you to talk to the 2 senators in the state where you live. You won't have to, I mean, you can talk to the House folks about, awareness and things, but if you communicate to them on PRMRP, they're going to direct you back to the Senate. And again, it is the only program like it. In some ways, it makes things a little bit easier because you only have to think about communicating to your Senate offices. But it's going to be really important that you and your friends and your family and anybody else that you'd work with. And I almost look at it sometimes like an organizational special event, a walk or a run, or things where you're reaching out to your coworkers and your friends and saying, hey, I have a brief window of opportunity here for you to help support, our organization. I know in some cases you're asking folks for financial support, to support our cause. In this case, you're asking them for a brief period of time for them to communicate an email or call their members of the Senate and ask for support so we can get more and more of those voices going to the Senate folks. Senators have what's called sort of official appropriations requests. That's part of what I'm doing on behalf of the organization. So there's portals in each of their congressional websites. In fact, I encourage folks, if you want to go visit your Senate, your 2 Senate offices, you'll see that many cases under a tab there called services, there'll be a drop-down menu, and it might be things like internship requests, visiting DC, what would you need? If you want a tour of the White House, you might have a problem with casework, so your Social Security check was delayed or something like that. And within that, there might be a tab that says appropriations. And you can go in there and you'll see there's an actual, usually it's a Google Doc, and I'm going to be submitting our request officially to those offices. It's just a sort of bureaucratic step in the process. It's an important one, and just one that that we're doing. Anna and I are driving that forward on behalf of the organization. But usually, sometimes if you'll talk to an office about supporting this, they'll want to know if that's been done or not. And so hopefully in most cases, we'll be able to cover the terrain pretty well. But just want you to know that we'll be doing that behind the scenes. At the end of all of this, expected, late July is when we're going to find out if we've been successful. So this is the timeline, right? So today is March 20th. We've got a lot of work to do, and ultimately we'll be able to see when that report comes out that I had a picture of on the previous slide, are we in that list of conditions or not? That's when we'll know. Unless something extraordinary happens and the Senate doesn't act on their defense bill, this year by that timeline. But in general, historically, that's when they've produced their report that indicates whether we're there. Okay, so what are we doing? What's our call for action? Why are you guys here today? What's important? What can you do, right? We talked about, some of the tough sledding we've got. We've talked about the process. We talked about the huge opportunity here. You all are key to our success, right? This won't happen without you. So what can you do? What do we need you to do? So as I said, we need folks to make calls, emails, letters. This is the time to mobilize our community to communicate our support for this request to the United States Senate. It helps a lot if you can personalize that communication. We were going to get to this in a minute, but there's a template letter that we have up that you can use for your email. There's talking points for your calls, everything you need so that we're sticking on message, right? The message is and needs to be in every single communication. We want to be eligible as part of the Department of Defense appropriations bill for PRMRP. That's got to be in everything. But what's really important is that they understand your story, okay? It gives it an authentic feel. They understand that it's not just bots on social media trying to influence things. It's real people with real compelling stories and understanding for just a moment what it's like to walk in your shoes. It is the most important and most compelling thing that's key to our success. It's the thing that they will remember. So when I do, physical in-person meetings with members of Congress on healthcare issues, in a given week, that staff may see people that represent hospitals. They might represent, neurologists or other, specialty organizations. They might talk to people who provide home oxygen. They could talk to people who do nursing homes, biopharmaceutical companies. There's a whole host of people they're hearing from. But I guarantee you, when a rare disease advocate talks about their journey and their story, that's the story that sticks that week. They might not remember any of those other things, but they're going to remember you. So just think about how to, encapsulate your story so that they understand and they can link it to the fact that we still don't have and deserve to have FDA approved treatments for this rare disease. And that they're supporting this funding is what's key to our getting to that goal. And that is incredibly important. So make it personal. You don't have to make it long. I don't want it to be like a 3-page letter, an hour-long communication. But just think about ways to distill that down. And then you should get a reply back. But there's opportunities for us to do some follow-up, which I think is really important, right? We really want to make sure that they understand that we're an organization that's going to hold them accountable and say, hey, I really want to understand what your answer is to our requests. We'll talk about ways to do that. As we get more into the process of this, we anticipate having an opportunity for individuals who are interested to this is sort of our Advocacy 101. But we'll offer a graduate degree program, if you will, which will involve requesting and doing virtual meetings for most folks. But if some event brings you to DC in the spring and you want to get in front of folks in person, that's partly also why I'm here. So I would encourage folks to let me know, and I work with everybody to set those up, and I would join you for those meetings. But I think in most cases we're talking about folks who would be setting up virtual meetings, and again, we're going to provide all of the support and help that you need to do that. But that some people may say that's great, and we totally get that. Some people also might say, look, I'm more comfortable just doing the letter writing or the calls, and that helps too. All of this is really, really important. Okay, so let's start talking about what tools are available to help you do this. Okay, so Anna, I don't know if you want to talk more about this than I do, since I know you've helped put this together.
Sure, I can absolutely talk about just sort of what you're looking at right here. So this is our website. So if you go to fshdSociety.org/advocacy, this is the page that pops up. And we've sort of put this PRMRP advocacy at the top of the page so that it's first and foremost, because this is the most important thing right now for the next month. So if you look at the little menu on the left-hand side there are 4 tabs. And so the first tab is what we have open right now. The peer-reviewed medical research program just kind of tells you a little bit about what this is and what we're after here. So ultimately, if you go through these steps, that's what we need. So once you understand what it is we are looking at, you can click to the next. This is just a screenshot, right?
No, just a screenshot, but I can advance you through the slides.
Oh, okay. Go to the next slide. So if you click down to the next tab, find your senator, the first thing you need to do is figure out who to contact. And you do that by, you could click on this link. If you happen to know your senators, that's great. When you click on this link, you enter your state, and that will tell you who your senators are. And when I was tinkering with it, what I was getting was pictures, names, and mailing addresses, and usually a phone number. There is also like a little link, and I wrote this in here. There's a little link right under the picture that says contact, and that's what brings you to the email address or the contact form on their website that you can fill out. So I just wanted to make note of, if you're planning to send an email, it might take a couple of clicks to get there, but it is in there. Let's see. Da, 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 da. Yeah, so if it advance again, once you figure out who you're contacting, then you can go down to the next menu item, and Kevin has wonderfully provided some templates for us to use. There is a message template, and actually don't know if it's in this screenshot, but if it's not there, it will be there momentarily, where we also have a list of talking points that are easier to talk through over the phone. So a couple of different templates that you can use, but as Kevin mentioned earlier, important to have a good look at that first and really add your personal notes and your story to make it impactful. Yeah. So once you download the template, you can copy paste this into your email or the contact form, whichever you're using. But we do ask you to go through and look at the brackets and the highlights and make sure that you're customizing those so that it's not just Dear Senator last name, it's Dear Senator King, so that it makes more sense. But once you have done those things, once you've either sent off the email or filled out the contact form and hit submit, or we would ask that you please let us know that you've done that. And that helps us on the back end really understand what communications are flying around. That helps us strategize a little bit. If we see there's a particular concentration in one area, we can maybe focus on that, or it helps us understand where the gaps are. We'd really like to know. And the only way to do that is to take the additional step of telling us. So I have created a quick form here that's linked in that last menu item that you can just fill in your information. And this is where, once you have done all of this, it's just a quick, who you are and how we find you if we need to. The last item, the last question in that form is, I'm interested in attending and or sharing my story in a Zoom meeting with my senator or their healthcare staff. That's what we would like to know too, so that as we move into April, after all of these communications have happened, Kevin alluded that he will be hosting the graduate version of this of this webinar for the folks who are interested in doing those this face-to-face or those live and in-person meetings with the senators or their healthcare staffers to talk about this. So I know many of you have talked to me previously. I can see a couple of names on this call that I already have on my list, but please do let us know that that's something that you're interested in doing so that we can organize and strategize around that as we move into the next few weeks.
Yeah, and as your boots on the ground here in Washington, it's really important for Anna and I to be aware of this, because this is information we can take to these Senate offices and elevate. We can make sure that they understand that 10 people from their state, have contacted them on this, and we want to know what's happening. So it allows us to have a more potent, awareness opportunity, and it increases the chances that they're going to pay attention to what we're doing. So it may not seem that important to let us know, but it's really important because this is actionable information that we can use in our campaign. So please do, utilize this, I think, pretty simple and easy form that Anna has put together. It's really important to our success. And that's it for our the formal presentation. I know we've offered now to do the Q&A piece of this. So I'm going to stop screen sharing so I can see what I'm doing again. You don't really need to see a white slide with a question on it.
No. While we're waiting for folks to ask any questions they might have, I guess I might just sort of distill this entire presentation down into, the ask that we're making of the FSHD community today is that we're advocating for a new source of government funding for FSHD research. And that's really what it comes down to. For so much of our organization's history, so much research has relied on donor funding, and as you saw early in the presentation, the level of NIH funding has been pretty stagnant over the past 8 years, and so we're looking for new sources of funding for basic research. And to sort of piggyback on that, the importance of basic research, I think, can't possibly be overstated. Um, while we are very lucky to be in a position where we have companies that have potential therapeutics and clinical trials right now, there is still so much we don't know about FSHD, and a lot of that basic research is really informing clinical trial design and therapeutic development in so many ways. And so we really, really need this research to continue and to be ongoing. So this the funding is important because the research is critical. Is I guess what I wanted to say. With that, if anybody has any questions that they'd like to ask, now would be the time. But being recorded and it will be posted on YouTube. So feel free to come back and reference this later. We got one, oh, thank you. We got one comment that said that we were clear and easy to understand. So Kevin, you're the best. And then we got a question from someone who is outside of the US. And yes, I will say that this particular program applies to applies within the US. This is a US government advocacy program.
Yeah, I mean, I always am appreciative of folks outside of the US that see this and want to be engaged. It's not that you can't comment, it's just that members of Congress, senators are, they're elected by their members of their state. That's the voices that they're paid to represent. They're not really gonna, the someone from Europe isn't going to have any, they're not going to have an impact on their decision. But, if there's things that you can, I've always told people if there's things that are happening in your country, where we could help provide you with some guidance or something, happy to do that to the extent that our system translates into, what you all are doing.
Helen just quickly asked if I could share contact information in the chat. I have just put my information in there. I can be reached at anna.gilmore@fshtsociety.org. And happy to answer questions, or if I need to punt them over to Kevin, happy to do that as well. So feel free to reach out to me with follow-up questions that you have. And I think with that, I don't know, I want to give Ashley the opportunity to share any closing comments, but mostly thank you to Kevin for your presentation.
No, Anna, thank you. I mean, as I said in the very beginning, it's a real honor to get to work with you guys and help. I hope just if there's any message I can leave is that you guys have power, and you particularly have power now. And I know that, a lot of times it might not seem like it. It might not seem like your elected leaders are going to pay attention to you, but I think that, you're going to find that we have an impact. And I really hope that you all join us on this journey. And I think at the end of the day, it's going to lead to us being successful in securing extra research funding that'll be vitally important to our mission. So, happy to work with Anna. If anybody has any questions, as I said, I want to be available to folks as well. And, I'm here to help.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kevin and Anna. Really, I mean, I don't know how I can give much of a closing after that, but thank you for being part of our community and for really helping people understand how they can get involved now. Obviously, we have some exciting times ahead. So I think that it's really great that these individuals already showed up today because they're showing that they want to make a difference. And we thank you, our community, for being here. With that, we will go ahead and end our session for today. Oh, real quick, actually, a reminder to please join us at our next FSHD University webinar. It will take place on Thursday, April 17th. Our guest presenter will be physiotherapist Ulrike Uta from the Muscular Dystrophy Support Center in Coventry from the United Kingdom, and she will discuss exercise and physical therapy for FSHD. It promises to be a pretty interesting topic because she's going to address how to make muscles that are overworking work less hard and to get those that are underworking to work as well as they can, all within the frame of FSHD. As always, please visit our website and our events calendar to see what's coming up in your chapter, other wellness and education events. And thank you just for being part of our community. We'll see you next month.